What is the role of history to the current world? One way we can look at is that history does provide what we are calling a unitary lens through which the human experience can be observed. The role of history is that it's something that can be observed through the arts that we have today, the scientific breakthroughs, and the political innovations. All of these do point to what we are calling history today. Therefore, any history that has been omitted simply means that history has no role to anything of what the world is today, but is that the true picture? So let's look at the parts of the world that have been omitted, or rather, nobody talks about them, or very little information does exist on these parts of the world. One, we can look at what we are calling the medieval Africa, which is the period between the 1250 to the 1800. And if you search on Africa during this period, there's little or no information that exists on Africa in that particular period. But then, of course, we've got the exception of Egypt, Nubia, and North Africa. Of course, you will find some sort of information about these places. Then, of course, West Africa has been mentioned, but mostly it tends to be mentioned through, or rather in conjunction with, European imperialism. But then the question would be, why has the history of Africa been omitted, or rather not studied or investigated, to see how Africans lived during this period that we have mentioned? We've got answers from different authors that have answered this particular question. I've got one from Kaper who says, so Kaper is an anthropologist and a paleanthropologist. Forgive me if I didn't pronounce that correctly. But he says there are a number of reasons why African history is often out of the mainstream narrative. For example, the mainstream like to spread false or misleading information about Africa in order to make themselves feel better or more powerful. He also goes on to say some Western museums and cultural institutions have historically stolen artifacts and art from Africa so that they can reinforce harmful stereotypes and perpetuate colonial narratives. He also says African history has often been shaped by Western colonizers and scholars who have tended to focus their own experience and perspectives rather than those of African people. They have no idea who the people are, their culture, traditions, spirituality, lifestyle, etc. But yet, they seem to think they know it all. He also went on to say this has led to a distorted and incomplete understanding of African history that does not accurately reflect the complexity and diversity of the continent's past. So, in order to maintain their own sense of superiority, they have excluded African history from the mainstream narratives, perpetuating false or distorted narratives about Africa. African history has been marginalized in the mainstream narrative, especially African scholars and their research. That is why we need more work to create a more conclusive and accurate understanding of the continent's past. So that is Kaber, and I do agree with him because you find that there are so many great things that are in Africa that, of course, are belonging to, rather supposed to be discussed in the history. We've got things like the Great War of Zimbabwe, there's the Great War of Benin. All those things you find are things that are never mentioned. but they do exist. Just because the assumption is that Africans can't really build what we are calling the Great Wall of Zimbabwe, the Great Wall. And then, as he has also mentioned, some of the artifacts have really been stolen. Why? Because that is evidence for us to show what Africa was before. But yeah, so that does not exist. So it becomes a little bit difficult to trace what Africa was, because most of the things have been destroyed. We've got them, the library called Alexandria, which is, I don't know if it's still there in Egypt, but it's something that has been burnt. So that library contained a lot of information about Africa, but it's something that has been destroyed and no information is there today. So I've got another response to that question from Dana Penny, who works at the University of Aha. Okay, he works at the university. I don't know how to pronounce that university, but she says there is cultural biasness. So people are deliberately kept in the dark about the history of the African continent by those wanting to pretend that its peoples were just a bunch of half-naked savages. She also goes on to say, yes, I am aware that African Americans were initially sold out into slavery by other Africans, to be purchased by Europeans. There's nothing unique or special about this, as human greed is universal and colorblind, and nobody involved with slavery as either a buyer or a seller comes away with clean hands. Yeah, you find that the issue of slavery is something that has been, taught, spoken very well about, and well recorded. But then the question would be, is it that the Europeans just came and grabbed all these people and took them as slaves? No, that's not the case. The case is that they were sold by Africans themselves. The leaders of Africa did sell those people to Americans, but then as slaves. But then the narrative is that these people just came, conquered, and took everybody as slaves, and off they went. Which is, yeah, so that they give us a picture of who Europe is. They conquered and took Africa by surprise, and of course they went as slaves. But then I've got another response from Mark Ian Payne on the same question. So he says, archaeology for the most part is not really conducted seriously in Africa. They do not search for civilizations, artifacts over most of the continent. So he also going to say, I got into a debate with David Kiliki of a particular university, who was supposed to be the expert on African metallurgy. I said iron working originated in Swahili-speaking territory, where he has done most of his work. He claimed it to be an import, despite having no evidence. So you see, so according to Mark, he says iron working began in Swahili, but then this David comes in and says, no, that was imported to that particular region without evidence. For them, they can narrate and give anything, even if there's no evidence, and it goes. Okay. So Mark goes on to say, my linguistic, oral, and religious evidence was not acceptable despite being correlated in other cultures. My point is that history is a humanity not considered even a reliable social science. I can have Marxist history with different conclusions from a structuralist. history of the same society. Sociology and anthropology have been done, but much of it is Eurocentric. Where is the archaeology of the Dogon or the Akan or Zimbabwe? Thus, with artifacts stolen and sitting in European museums and no substantial archaeological being done, we have lack of artifact evidence. So most of the items that can be used to actually narrate what Africa was, most of it has been stolen, like I mentioned, and of course Mark is mentioning, and destroyed. Then we've got another response from James Tedesco. So he says, this is very easy to work out for yourself. Why is Australian history not even mentioned in the Senegal education system? Why doesn't the Mongolian education system cover the politics and history of New Zealand? The answer is simple. Every country starts its history studies in its own bucket. So what that simply means, what James is saying, is that we need to make our own history from our own studies, because most of the history that we have, the history I learned, is all about the World War what. But then are those the history? Are we even mentioned in that World War One, Two, the Hitler, all of those? You know, it's something that is not much inclined to our history. So we need to rewrite and recreate our own history, studying, investigating, and writing it down as our own history. Then the last response, of course, is coming from Steve Hayes. So he says, I don't think African history as such has been suppressed, okay? Though certain aspects of it have been suppressed and distorted, as happens to other history as well, because of vested interests, of course. But I feel ours has been suppressed because the vested interests are just too huge. Whatever they are hiding, you never know. So he also goes on to say African history may be neglected outside Africa because people think their own local history is more important. And within Africa, especially during the colonial period, education was controlled by the colonizers, who emphasized the history of the metropolitan town. So in the history of Christianity, he goes on to mention, which is his field, most of the history and historiography has been Eurocentric, playing down the African contribution. For example, the so-called Nicene Creed, I think the Catholics would know better about the Nicene Creed, which is used by most Christians throughout the world, was formulated in response to a theological dispute that took place in Africa. And the formulation owes much to an African theologian who is called Athanasius of Alexandria. Also, the instrument that was used for Christianization of most part of Europe, which is the monasticism, was forged in Africa. He also goes on to say, but those and many other instances could one think of, are the result of neglect rather than suppression. In Southern Africa, there have been various historical legends and distortions. He goes on to mention one that is being circulated recently is that South Africa was an empty land when the Dutch settled in what is now Cape Town in 1652, and that all other inhabitants came later. But evidence from earlier settlers were shipwrecked along the coast shows that the land was already inhabited before then, and archaeological evidence shows that people living there several centuries earlier had a similar material cultural to those encountered by shipwrecked sailors in the 16th century. Well, those were the responses from the various authors on why most of African history has been left out of the narratives. But then when we look at the world history right now, you find these great write-ups on so many places or civilization that is there. We've got the Sumerian civilization. It's well narrated, well written, and well understood by many. The Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Pharaonic Egypt, the Harappan culture, Vedic civilization, Chinese dynasties, Greco-Roman civilization, the Mayans of Central America, and the Incas, all that history that dates way back is very well written, but not that of Africa. Well, so today I want to share with you one of the great empires that existed in Africa, so that we begin to learn to say information really is there. I think African scholars have begun digging this information to give us, and it's our role to try and read and understand what Africa was, what history is there pertaining to Africa, rather than sitting on the narratives that we've been given before. So I have what we are calling the great empires of Africa that I have been studying. So one of them is the great empire of Ghana. Okay, so the great empire of Ghana is, of course, an empire which lay inland from the Atlantic coast of West Africa and about 100 miles north of the Niger River. Of course, it is not to be confused with the Ghana which is now today, the Republic of Ghana. But then you find that the name Ghana was brought, or rather was named after the great empire of Ghana. So the empire of Ghana existed after the 500 CE, and of course lasted until late in the 12th century. The principal people of the ancient Ghana were the Soninke. So the Soninke people cause the great empire of Ghana, they also call it as Wagato. Okay, so that is its traditional, I may say, name. Okay, so it existed after the 500 CE and lasted until late in the 12th century. So the Soninke people were the occupants of this great empire of Ghana, where the early farmers were the first to take advantage of what we are calling the iron technology that developed in West Africa by about 500 to 400 BCE. So you find that the early Soninke superior iron weaponry and horses brought from the nomads of the Sahara Desert made it possible for them to establish what we are calling the Ghana, the great empire of Ghana. So they gradually expanded their territories and dominated neighboring rulers until by the 10th century the kingdom had become an empire. So the Soninke people's ideas about their history are expressed in the legend of Wagadu, which I've already mentioned. So Wagadu is like the name of Ghana itself. They called it Wagadu, an oral tradition told by many generations of the Gesserit. So the legend often begins by describing how the ancestor Dinga came from somewhere in the Middle East. So the narrative is that Dinga was the first person or the first leader of what we can call the Great Empire of Ghana. Some say he stayed for a very long time at Djenne, an ancient city that still exists on the Niger River, north of what we are calling modern Mali's capital, Bamako. So Dinga later moved to the town of Dia in the Middle Delta, where he married and had two sons who became Soninke ancestors in other towns of Sahel. So Dinga's movements from place to place is a symbol that shows the presence of Soninke populations in various parts of the Sahel lands. Dinga moved and arrived at a place southwest of Nyoro in today's Mali. This land was dominated by the Jini, okay? Or we can also call them the spirits of the bush who fought with Dinga. So Dinga emerged victorious and married the three daughters of the chief Jimmy. The sons from these wives became the ancestors of many Soninke clans, one of which was Sise. So Sise was one of the sons of Dinga. So it was Sise that became the ruling clan of the Wagadu. And when Dinga grew old and blind, he decided that before he dies, he has to pass his chiefly power on to his oldest son, Kinu. But a younger son named Diabe Sise disguised himself as the oldest brother and saved his father into giving him the chiefly powers. So according to one version of the story, after Dinga died, Diabe Sise had to flee from the wrath of his enraged older brother and took refuge in the wilderness. Okay. So Diabe Sise arrived at the site where the town of Kumbisale was to be established. He found it guarded by a giant snake named Bida. So Diabe Sise entered into a pact with the snake. They agreed that Diabe Sise could settle there and that Bida would remain the guardian of the place on condition that every year the great serpent or the snake be given the most beautiful young virgin. In return, of course, for this, there would be an sacrifice. So Bida guaranteed that abundant rainfall on Wagadu and that there would be a plentiful supply of gold. The new kingdom was called Wagadu and had its capital at Kumbi Saleh. It prospered under the rule of Diabe Sise and his descendants, who are known by the title of Magan. The descendants of Diabe Sise and the descendants of the forefather or commanders of the provinces were recognized as the aristocratic clans of the Soninke. Once a year, representatives of the four provinces of Wagadu would assemble at Kumbi Saleh to participate in a virgin sacrifice to Bida, the guardian serpent. This ceremony was the annual renewal of the pact between Diabe Sise and Bida. And according to some versions of the legend, each year a different province was required to supply a virgin for the sacrifice. If this was actually the practice, it was a custom that probably helped promote unity in the kingdom. Let's look at the regional and trans-Saharan trade. So the Soninke's early movement with the traders of the Sahara is one of the reasons Ghana emerged as the first great power of the medieval Sahel. The other main reason is that Ghana controlled the sources of gold, and the ruler of Ghana is the wealthiest king on the face of the earth because of his treasures and stocks of gold extracted. Efficient food production, early control of iron technology for superior weaponry, and the acquisition of horses helped the Soninke achieve early superiority over their neighbors. Ayakib described Ghana as one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Western Sudan, with the ruler who had other kings under his authority. What eventually raised the Soninke's kingdom to the level of an empire was its control of both regional and trans-Saharan trade. The regional trade involved the exchange of salt, copper, and dates from the Sahara. Products from the savanna areas included slaves, livestock, iron tools, weapons and utensils, animal hides, leather goods such as sandals, cushions, and bags, locally woven and dyed cloth, clay pottery, woven grass products such as baskets and sleeping mats, medicinal herbs, cola nuts and foodstuffs such as dried fish, rice, various grains, condiments, spices, honey, and fruits, and so on. So from further the south, nearer the forest, came gold and the colonies. On a broader scale, Ghana was well positioned to dominate the international caravan trade across the Western Sahara and to the Middle East and to the Mediterranean Sea. One of the most important reasons for that commercial development had been the introduction of the camel into North Africa. Let's now look at the city of Watergast and its contribution to what we are calling the Great Empire of Ghana. So, during the period of Ghana's greatest power, in the late 10th and 11th centuries, one of the most important commercial cities under its control was Watergast, which was about 125 miles northwest of Kumbi Saleh. Abu Ubayyad al-Bakri described it as a large, populous town with well-built houses. The main traders of Watergast were the Berbers of the Zanata clan from the Atlas mountain region in Morocco. So in 1056, the Almoravids captured Watergast from Ghana because of the powerful Almoravid influence. Many Soninke of Ghana who had retained their traditional religious riches with the sacred serpent and other spirits were converted, sometimes forcibly, to Islam. Luckily, the Almoravid commander Abubakar died in 1087 and was replaced not by a single successor but by 6 men from among his sons and nephews. So the 6 men fought with one another in a power struggle that destroyed the Almoravid unity and cost them whatever advantage they had gained over the Soninke people. As a result, by 1100, Ghana regained its commercial and political dominance. And the decline, of course, of the Ghana Empire. So the Ghana Empire began to collapse in the 12th century CE. The decline set in when other competing trade routes opened up further east and when the climate became usually dry from a prolonged period, which affected agricultural production. So you find that the rulers of Ghana did not help themselves, as either the empire was beset by a string of civil wars, the divisions perhaps based on the inherent conflict between Islam and animist beliefs. Meanwhile, many rebellious chiefs took the opportunity of the weak central government to declare themselves independent of the empire, notably Tekuru in the Western Sudan region, which controlled the Senegal River and which had even allied itself with the Arabians. So that is it about the great empire of what we are calling Ghana. So be rest assured that there is a great history that existed in Africa, rather than the narrative that we have been given each and every day. So it's your role to take an active interest and read about what Africa was before. Because there is, if you find these things, if you search on Google, very little information does exist. But then there are books that are there. You can search and find that there is information, of course, pertaining to what Africa was. So I hope you did find this piece of information informative and educative, and of course that you've learned something new today. I hope to give you further more information about what Africa was, and something that we are not told, or rather something that is not investigated by those who would be with whatever interest in that world. So thank you so much. See you next time.